The air in the executive corridor of Sterling Technologies didn't smell like innovation or power today. It smelled like cheap vanilla body spray and impending disaster. Jessica, the CEO's young administrative assistant, stood frozen behind her desk, her face drained of color. She looked like she had just witnessed a murder. Her eyes darted frantically between the closed double doors of the CEO's office and the woman standing in front of her. "Mrs. Sterling," Jessica stammered, her voice trembling. Maybe you should just go home, Caleb is. He's in a very important meeting, a strategy session." Sabrina Vance stood motionless, her posture impeccable in a simple trench coat that hid her figure. In her hand, she held an insulated bag containing Caleb's favorite roast beef sandwiches, prepared exactly how he liked them. Medium rare, extra horseradish. She looked at the terrified assistant and offered a small, sad smile. She knew exactly what kind of strategy was being discussed behind those soundproofed mahogany doors. The soundproofing at Sterling Tech was top tier, rumored to be military grade, but Caleb Sterling had made a fatal error. He hadn't closed the door all the way. A sliver of light cut through the gap, and voices drifted out, clear as a bell, in the silent hallway. "Caleb, you're terrible." A woman's voice giggled, high-pitched, breathless, and young. It was Molly, the new calibeting intern who had joined 3 months ago. "What if your wife finds out? I heard she's famously devoted. If she makes a scene, the board will have a heart attack." "Sabrina," Caleb's voice followed, rich with that smooth, confident baritone that had once made Sabrina's heart race. Now, it just sounded like arrogance. "Don't worry about her. She's like a piece of old furniture, Molly. Comfortable, reliable, but completely silent. She wouldn't know how to make a scene if I handed her a script." Sabrina felt a coldness settle in her chest, turning her blood to ice. It wasn't the shock of the affair. She had suspected the late nights and the scent of vanilla on his shirts for weeks. It was the contempt. "Besides," Caleb continued, the sound of ice clinking against a glass echoing through the crack, "we've been married 7 years. The spark died 5 years ago. Now she just putters around the house, cooking soups and obsessing over my laundry. Honestly, it's pathetic. She has absolutely no idea how the real world works. If I divorced her today, she wouldn't survive a week in this city." "But the assets," Molly purred. "Doesn't she own half?" Caleb let out a scoffing laugh. "Please, I've already moved the liquid capital into the offshore trust. By the time I serve her the papers next month, on our anniversary, Sterling Tech will look like it's operating at a loss. She'll be lucky if she walks away with the car." Outside the door, Jessica looked like she wanted to vomit. She reached for the phone to warn her boss, but Sabrina raised a hand, stopping her. Sabrina's expression hadn't changed. There were no tears, no hysterics, no shaking rage. Instead, a terrifying calm washed over her. For 7 years, she had played the role of the supportive wife. She had hidden her brilliance to polish his ego. She had spent her nights rewriting his sloppy code while he slept, fixing the critical algorithms that made Sterling Tech a billion-dollar unicorn, all while letting him take the credit because he was the face of the company. He thought she was a housewife who didn't understand business. He thought Sterling Tech was his empire. Sabrina looked down at the lunch bag in her hand. She walked over to the nearest trash can and dropped it inside with a dull thud. Then she opened her designer tote bag and pulled out a single thin folder. "Jessica," Sabrina said, her voice smooth and cool, like water running over stones. "I won't interrupt their strategy session, but I need you to do something for me. Some women scream, throw Chardonnay, or slash tires. How dreadfully exhausting." Sabrina simply filed a legal notice. Caleb thought the company was his empire, because his name was on the door, completely forgetting who laid the bricks. Darling, never let a man mistake your quiet grace for ignorance. When you own the source code to his entire existence, a tantrum is entirely unnecessary. You just unplug his router. Anything, Mrs. Sterling, Jessica whispered. Place this on his desk after I leave. Tell him his lunch delivery arrived, but the menu has changed. Sabrina handed over the document. It wasn't a divorce petition. It wasn't a tear-stained letter. It was a formal legal notice, termination of intellectual property license, and immediate revocation of core algorithms. The document was signed not by Sabrina Vance, the housewife, but by V, the mysterious, legendary architect of the proprietary code that Sterling Tech was built upon. A figure Caleb had bragged about hiring exclusively. A figure the board revered. A figure Caleb had convinced himself was just a quiet partner he could control. He had forgotten that V was the initial for Vance. And Jessica? Sabrina added, adjusting her sunglasses. If he asks where I went, tell him I went to do what I do best, surviving. Sabrina turned on her heel and walked toward the elevator. Her steps light, her head high. She didn't look back, she checked her watch. It was 1:15 p.m. By 2 p.m., the servers hosting Sterling Tech's platform would begin to shut down remotely. Inside the office, the laughter died down. Caleb adjusted his tie, feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill in the room. Did you hear something? Molly asked, pulling away from him. Probably just the janitors. Caleb dismissed it. Leaning back in his leather chair, feeling like the king of the world. Anyway, as I was saying, once the IPO launches next quarter, we'll be untouchable. The door creaked open. Jessica walked in, eyes downcast, trembling, as she placed the blue folder on the expansive glass desk. Mr. Sterling, she squeaked. A delivery for you, Caleb frowned, picking up the folder. What is this? I wanted the roast beef. He flipped open the cover. His eyes scanned the header. Notice of revocation, breach of contract, immediate cessation of operations. Caleb's brow furrowed. He read the signature line at the bottom. Signed, Sabrina Vance. The color drained from Caleb Sterling's face so fast it looked like his soul had left his body. The glass of scotch slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. But the sound was drowned out by the roaring silence in his head. The boring housewife didn't just make sandwiches. She owned the company's brain, and she had just turned off the switch. Caleb Sterling drove his Porsche 911 like a man fleeing a crime scene, weaving through the afternoon traffic of the Merritt Parkway with white-knuckled desperation. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the chaos swirling in his mind. It had to be a mistake, or a bluff. Yes, that was it, a desperate attention, seeking bluff from a woman who felt her expiration date approaching. Sabrina wouldn't dare shut down the core algorithms. She loved him. She was obsessed with him. This was just a tantrum, a cry for help, because she probably sensed he was pulling away. He would go home, turn on the charm, maybe squeeze out a few fake tears, and promise her a second honeymoon in the Maldives. She would fold, she always folded. He pulled into the driveway of their sprawling estate in Greenwich, the gravel crunching loudly under his tires. The house stood majestic on the hill, a symbol of everything he had achieved, or rather, everything he had claimed credit for. He didn't bother with the garage. He parked crookedly on the front lawn and stormed toward the massive oak double doors. He punched his code into the biometric keypad, 10:15, the date of the first time they met. Bezetts, a red light flashed. Access denied. Caleb frowned, wiping sweat from his forehead. He punched it again, harder this time. 10:15. Bazette's access denied. What the hell? Caleb muttered. He pressed his thumb against the scanner. Bizest, user not recognized. A cool, synthetic female voice drifted from the hidden speakers in the porch ceiling. It was the house's AI system, Aura, which Caleb liked to brag he had beta, tested himself. I'm sorry, but there is no user profile for Caleb Sterling in the active registry. Please vacate the premises. Aura override, Caleb shouted at the ceiling, his composure cracking. It's me, Caleb. Open the goddamn door. Voice pattern analyzed, Aura responded smoothly. Threat level, moderate, initiating level 1 defense protocol. Before Caleb could process what level 1 meant, the hidden sprinkler heads lining the manicured flower beds erupted, but they weren't aiming at the hydrangeas. They swiveled with military precision, targeting the man standing on the porch. Icy water blasted him from 3 angles. Caleb gasped, shielding his face. His custom Italian wool suit soaking through in seconds. He scrambled backward, slipping on the wet slate tiles, flailing his arms like a windmill before crashing hard onto his backside in a puddle of mud. Caleb, a shrill scream pierced the air. Caleb wiped the mud from his eyes to see a yellow taxi idling at the gate. Molly was stepping out, looking like a runway model in a white silk dress, clutching a bottle of Dom Perignon. She had clearly come expecting a celebration, perhaps to measure the drapes for her new life as the lady of the manor. Instead, she saw the CEO of Sterling Tech sprawled in the mud, looking like a drowned rat. What is going on? Molly shrieked, running over, her heels sinking into the soft grass. Why are the sprinklers on? Turn them off. Don't come closer, Caleb sputtered, spitting out dirty water too late. The AI system tracked the new movement. Accomplice detected, Aura announced. Widening perimeter. The perimeter sprinklers hissed to life. A curtain of water swept across the lawn, drenching Molly instantly. Her expensive blowout collapsed, mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. She screamed, dropping the champagne bottle, which shattered on the driveway. My dress, this is dry clean only. Molly wailed, dancing around in a futile attempt to dodge the water jets. The commotion had attracted an audience. The neighbors, wealthy, bored retirees who lived for gossip, were peering through their curtains. Mrs. Gable, 3 houses down, was openly filming the spectacle with her iPhone from her porch. Miles away, in the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons, Sabrina Vance sat in a plush velvet armchair, a glass of Pinot Noir resting in her hand. On the iPad in her lap, the live feed from the Greenwich security cameras played out in high definition. She watched Caleb slip in the mud again as he tried to stand up. She watched Molly screaming at a sprinkler head. Sabrina took a slow sip of wine. It tasted like oak and victory. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, only a detached curiosity. It was fascinating, really, how quickly a man's dignity could dissolve when you stripped away the infrastructure he didn't build. She tapped the screen, opening the smart home admin panel. She saw the notification log. User Caleb deleted by admin V user. Molly tagged as solicitor. She had bought the house 2 years before she even met Caleb, with the royalties from her first major patent. He had moved in, filled it with his golf clubs and his ego, and forgotten whose name was on the deed. Just like he forgot whose code ran his company. Pathetic, she whispered to the empty room. She closed the app. The show was over. She had work to do. Back at the muddy estate, Caleb finally dragged himself and a sobbing Molly back to his Porsche. He was shivering, humiliated and furious. He reached into his wet pocket for his phone to call his lawyer, to call the police, to call anyone who could stop this madness. But his phone screen lit up with a different kind of alert. It wasn't a text message. It was a push notification from the Sterling Tech Server Cluster Manager, an app he only had on his phone for vanity, to show off to investors. Critical alert, license key revoked. System halt in progress. Servers 1 through 50 offline. Caleb stared at the screen, the water dripping from his nose onto the glass. The numbers on the screen were counting down, not seconds, but dollars. Millions of dollars evaporating into thin air as the company's platform crashed in real time. Caleb. Molly whined from the passenger seat, shivering. "Fix this, take me." Caleb didn't hear her. He stared at the phone, reading the final line of the system error message. Error 404, architect not found. For the first time in his life, Caleb Sterling realized he wasn't the player. He was just a piece on the board, and the queen had just made her move. The conference room at Sterling Tech was a glass cage of panic. It had been 24 hours since the servers went dark, and the company's stock was in free fall, bleeding value like a stuck pig. Caleb Sterling paced the head of the table, looking haggard. He had traded his ruined Italian suit for a fresh one, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed him. The board members, a collection of gray-haired men in expensive suits, were shouting over each other, demanding answers. "Caleb, the investors are pulling out," shouted the CFO, slamming a fist on the table. "Without the core algorithm, our platform is just a fancy website. We're losing $10 million an hour, fix it." "I am working on it," Caleb snapped, his voice hoarse. "It is a technical glitch, a negotiation tactic. My wife, Sabrina, she is just confused. I'll get her back in line." "Your wife?" The chairman of the board narrowed his eyes. "You mean the proprietary owner of the code?" "Caleb, did you honestly build a billion-dollar company on intellectual property owned by your spouse without a permanent transfer agreement?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Caleb opened his mouth to lie, but the doors swung open. A man walked in. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. It was Julian Blackwood. Julian was everything Caleb pretended to be: effortlessly elegant, undeniably powerful, and born into a legacy of wealth that stretched back to the Mayflower. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, and his presence commanded immediate, terrified respect. He was the head of Blackwood Capital, a global investment firm known for two things: saving distressed companies and devouring them whole. He was also, Caleb remembered with a jolt of bitterness, Sabrina's old college lab partner, the guy who always hovered in the background, the friend Caleb had successfully pushed out of the picture 7 years ago. "Gentlemen," Julian said, his voice smooth and dangerous. He didn't even look at Caleb. He took a seat at the opposite end of the table, his team of lawyers fanning out behind him like sharks smelling blood. "I hear you have a liquidity problem." "Julian," Caleb said, trying to muster a smile. "Good to see you. We're just having a minor hiccup. Nothing we can't handle." "A minor hiccup?" Julian raised an eyebrow. He slid a thick document across the polished mahogany table. "Your stock is down 40%. Your primary service is offline. You have 48 hours before the CC starts asking questions about your disclosures." "I am not here to catch up, Caleb. I am here to offer you a parachute." Caleb looked at the document. It was a capital injection agreement. $500 million, enough to stabilize the stock, pay the penalties, and maybe, just maybe, buy enough time to replicate Sabrina's code. "What are the terms?" Caleb asked, his hands sweating. "Standard," Julian shrugged. "Blackwood Capital takes a 51% controlling interest. You stay on as CEO, retain your title, your salary, your image. We handle the back end, we stabilize the tech. It was a deal with the devil, but it was a lifeline. Caleb's ego flared. He could stay CEO. He could keep the prestige. He could show Sabrina that he didn't need her, that he could find money anywhere. He would sign this, get the cash, hire 1,000 engineers to rewrite her code, and then divorce her with nothing. I need to read it, Caleb said. You have 10 minutes. Julian checked his vintage Patek Philippe watch. My jet leaves for London in an hour. Sign it or I walk. And Sterling Tech declares bankruptcy by morning. The pressure in the room was palpable. The board members were nodding, practically begging Caleb to sign. Caleb flipped through the pages. It was dense legalese. He scanned the numbers. $500 million. That was all he cared about. He looked at Julian. Julian looked bored, almost indifferent. That indifference convinced Caleb. Julian wasn't trying to trick him. He was just doing business. Caleb grabbed his Mont Blanc pen. Fine, Caleb said, signing his signature with a flourish. We have a deal. Pleasure doing business with you, Julian. I guess you always wanted a piece of my success. Caleb smirked, feeling a surge of triumph. He had survived. He had outmaneuvered Sabrina's little tantrum. Julian took the document back, checking the signature. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of partnership. It was the smile of a hunter who had just watched the trap snap shut. Success is a relative term, Caleb, Julian said softly. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. By the way, did you read Section 7, Article 3? Caleb frowned. The standard indemnity clause. Not quite, Julian said. Article 3 states that in the event the company cannot verify ownership of its core intellectual property within 24 hours of signing. Which we both know you can't, because Sabrina revoked it yesterday. The breach of warranty clause triggers immediately. Caleb's stomach dropped. What does that mean? It means, Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the silent room, that the $500 million isn't an investment. It becomes a high-interest debt, callable immediately, and the penalty for default is the personal seizure of all assets pledged by the guarantor. Julian leaned forward, his eyes cold as ice. You pledged everything, Caleb. Your shares, your offshore accounts, even that ridiculous yacht you bought last summer. You didn't just sign a partnership, you signed a confession of insolvency. You tricked me, Caleb roared, standing up, knocking his chair over. I didn't trick you, Julian replied calmly. I just banked on your arrogance. You never read the fine print, Caleb. You never did the work. You always relied on someone else to fix your mistakes. But she's not here anymore. Julian turned to the board. Gentlemen, Blackwood Capital will be conducting a hostile takeover effective immediately. I suggest you update your Arfe Sum phase. He walked to the door, pausing just before he left. He looked back at Caleb, who stood trembling, pale, and utterly destroyed. Oh, and Caleb? Julian added. Sabrina sends her regards. She said you wouldn't read it. She knows you better than you know yourself. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Caleb Sterling standing in a silent room, the ink on the contract still wet, realizing he hadn't just lost his company. He had just signed his own death warrant. The collapse of Caleb Sterling was not a slow burn. It was an explosion. Within 48 hours of signing Julian Blackwood's contract, the news hit Wall Street like a bomb. Sterling Tech default, CEO assets frozen, hostile takeover. The stock price didn't just dip, it flatlined. Caleb sat in his office, technically no longer his office, staring at the empty shelves. Security was waiting outside to escort him from the building. His phone had been ringing non-stop for 2 days. Lawyers, creditors, angry investors. He ignored them all. He had one card left to play, the emergency fund. 3 years ago, Caleb had set up a shell company in the Cayman Islands, siphoning off a percentage of Sterling Tech's profits. It was highly illegal, incredibly risky, and absolutely necessary for a man who knew deep down he was a fraud. There was nearly $10 million in that account, enough to flee the country, start over, disappear to a beach where nobody knew his name. He opened his laptop, his hands shaking as he logged into the secure banking portal. He typed in the password, access granted. He exhaled, a sob of relief catching in his throat. He clicked on account balance. The page loaded. Balance, $0. Caleb blinked. He refreshed the page. Balance, $0. No, he whispered, clicking frantically. No, 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 that's impossible. He checked the transaction history. A single withdrawal had been made 6 hours ago. The recipient account was untraceable, but the transaction note left a chillingly familiar signature. Transfer authorization. Molly D. The door to his office burst open. It wasn't security, it was Molly herself. She wasn't wearing the designer dresses he had bought her. She was wearing a simple professional pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She didn't look like the vapid, giggling intern anymore. She looked sharp, predatory, and completely unbothered. Molly, Caleb scrambled up, pointing a trembling finger at her. You stole it. You stole my money. I'll kill you. I'll call the cops. Molly laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. She walked over to the desk and tossed a small black device onto the glass surface, a digital voice recorder. Go ahead, Caleb, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Call the police. Tell them I stole the money you embezzled from your own shareholders. I'm sure the FBI would love to hear the details. Caleb froze. What? Who are you? I'm not an intern, Caleb. Molly sneered, leaning against the doorframe. I'm a forensic accountant. I work for a boutique firm that specializes in corporate espionage and whistleblower protection. I was hired 6 months ago by a competitor to find dirt on you. But frankly, you made it too easy. She gestured to the recorder. That has everything. Your conversations about the offshore accounts, your plans to defraud your wife, your admission that you don't own the IP. I already sent a copy to the SEC and the district attorney in exchange for full immunity and a percentage of the recovered assets, which, thanks to you, is quite a lot. I'm walking away clean. Caleb stared at her, his mind reeling. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for. The fresh spark he thought adored him. She was a plant, a spy. You slept with me, Caleb whispered, his voice cracking. Oh, I absolutely adore this twist. Caleb thought he was seducing a naive intern to stroke his fragile ego. In reality, he was sleeping with an auditor. Men like Caleb always believe they are the apex predators, never realizing they are merely the prey being weighed, measured, and documented. Molly didn't want his heart. She wanted his offshore routing numbers. A brilliant reminder. A man's arrogance is always his weakest password. Hazard of the job. Molly shrugged, checking her nails. And honestly, it was the hardest part of the assignment. You're as disappointing in bed as you are in the boardroom. She pushed off the doorframe, turning to leave. Oh, and Caleb, that money I took, I didn't keep it. I transferred it to the rightful owner of the intellectual property you've been monetizing for 7 years. Consider it back pay. She walked out, her heels clicking rhythmically down the hallway. Caleb sank back into his chair, utterly defeated. He had lost his wife. He had lost his company. He had lost his fortune. And now he realized he had lost his freedom. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder. Blue and red lights flashed against the windows of the office tower, reflecting on the glass walls like a strobe light in a nightmare. Heavy boots thundered down the corridor. "IFB, open up!" Caleb looked out the window at the city below. It looked so small from up here. He remembered Sabrina standing in this office a week ago, holding his lunch, looking at him with those sad, knowing eyes. He had called her boring. He had called her furniture. He realized now that she hadn't been boring. She had been the foundation. And he had taken a sledgehammer to the only thing holding him up. The door crashed open. Agents in windbreakers swarmed the room, weapons drawn. "Caleb Sterling, you are under arrest for securities fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering." As the handcuffs clicked tight around his wrists, cold and heavy, Caleb didn't fight. He just closed his eyes and saw the error message one last time. Architect not found. He was alone in the ruin he had built. A week later, a relentless storm battered New York City. The rain lashed against the pavement in sheets, turning the gutters into rushing rivers of gray sludge. Outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a charity gala was in full swing. A parade of limousines and luxury sedans idled at the curb, disgorging the city's elite under a canopy of umbrellas held by uniformed doormen. Cameras flashed, capturing diamonds and tuxedos. In the shadows of an alleyway across the street, a figure huddled against the brick wall, shivering violently. Caleb Sterling was unrecognizable. He was out on bail. His parents had mortgaged their retirement home in Florida to pay the bond. But he was destitute. His assets were frozen, his reputation incinerated. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting raincoat and sneakers that were soaking wet. He looked like a ghost, haunting the world he used to rule. He was waiting for her. He knew she would be here. Sabrina never missed the Met Gala. In the past, he had dragged her along as a prop, making her stand silently while he networked. Tonight, she was the guest of honor. A sleek phantom black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the red carpet. It glided to a stop, silent and imposing. The rear door opened. Caleb lunged from the shadows. "Sabrina!" He sprinted across the street, splashing through deep puddles, ignoring the honking horns of angry taxi drivers. He reached the car just as a woman stepped out. It was Sabrina, but it wasn't the Sabrina he knew. She wore a gown of shimmering silver that looked like liquid moonlight, cut to perfection. Her hair was swept up, revealing a neck adorned with a sapphire necklace that probably cost more than Sterling Tech was currently worth. She looked radiant, powerful, and terrifyingly distant. "Sabrina, please," Caleb gasped, grabbing the handle of the car door before security could intercept him. He looked pathetic, water dripping from his nose, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Talk to me, just 5 minutes, I'm begging you." Sabrina paused. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable behind the curtain of rain. She didn't recoil, she didn't look scared. She just looked bored, "Caleb," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the storm. "You're ruining the upholstery." "I made a mistake." Caleb sobbed, dropping to his knees in the street, oblivious to the cameras turning toward them. "I was an idiot. Molly meant nothing. I love you, Sabrina. We were a team. We built everything together. Remember college. Remember the letters I wrote you. You said they were the most beautiful things you'd ever read. You said my soul was poetic. Please, don't throw away our love because of one mistake." He was playing his last card, the scent. Those letters had been the foundation of their romance. The reason she had given a nerdy, awkward coder a chance. Sabrina stared at him. Then, for the first time in weeks, she laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was a laugh of genuine, pitying disbelief. "Oh, Caleb," she sighed, shaking her head. "You still don't get it, do you?" She leaned down, her face inches from his, protected by the umbrella held by the doorman. "Those letters, the poetry, the deep, soulful longing," she whispered, her voice soft but lethal. "You didn't write them." Caleb blinked, confusion breaking through his hysteria. "What, of course I did. I copied them. I mean, I wrote them." "No," a deep voice came from inside the car. "A man incapable of writing his own code is, quite naturally, incapable of writing his own love letters." Caleb outsourced his romance, just as he outsourced his intellect. He was never a partner. He was a middleman. Realizing your marriage is a fabrication could break a lesser woman. For Sabrina, it was merely the final audit. She didn't lose a poet, she just fired a very bad plagiarist. A hand reached out, strong and steady, pulling Sabrina gently back. Julian Blackwood leaned forward into the light. He looked impeccable in a tuxedo, dry and warm. "I wrote them," Julian said simply. Caleb stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like in college, Julian continued, his eyes locking onto Caleb's with a mixture of contempt and triumph. "You begged me to help you woo the smartest girl in the class. You said you couldn't put two sentences together without sounding like a manual. So I wrote them. Every word, every metaphor, every promise of eternal devotion." He looked up at Sabrina, his gaze softening into adoration. "I wrote them to her, Caleb. I just let you sign your name because I was a coward back then. I thought she wanted the loud, confident frontman. I didn't think she'd want the quiet guy in the library." Sabrina looked at Julian, a tender smile touching her lips. "I kept them, not because of Caleb, but because the words, they always felt like they came from someone else, someone who actually saw me." She turned back to Caleb, her face hardening into stone. "You were never the poet, Caleb. You were just the postman. And you were never the architect. You were just the facade. And now, you're just a stranger in the rain." "Julian," Sabrina said, turning her back on her ex-husband, "let's go inside. It is cold out here." "Sabrina, no!" Caleb screamed, lunging forward again. But a wall of security guards materialized, blocking his path. He watched helplessly as Julian took Sabrina's hand, helping her out of the rain and onto the red carpet. They looked like royalty. They looked like they belonged together. Caleb was left kneeling in the gutter, the rain washing away his tears, the realization crashing down on him with the weight of a skyscraper. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had been living a lie for 7 years. He had stolen another man's words, another woman's genius, and convinced himself he was a god. Now, stripped of the lies, he was nothing. The Rolls-Royce pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the stormy night, leaving Caleb Sterling alone in the dark, with nothing but the echo of a love story that was never his to begin with. 6 months later, the morning sun bathed the streets of Manhattan in a crisp, golden light. It was a day for new beginnings, but for Caleb Sterling, it was the end. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was swarming with reporters. They weren't there to celebrate him. They were there to document the fall of a tech titan. Caleb shuffled out of the transport van, his wrists cuffed, his ankles shackled. He wore an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his gaunt frame. His hair, once perfectly gelled, was shaved close to his scalp. He kept his head down, refusing to look at the cameras, refusing to see the pity and the glee in the eyes of the public. The judge's gavel had fallen an hour ago, guilty on all counts. 20 years, no parole for at least 15. He was being led toward the transport bus that would take him to a maximum security facility in upstate New York. As he waited for the guards to open the heavy steel cage door, his eyes drifted upward, across the street, on the massive digital billboard that dominated Times Square. A familiar face looked down at him. It was Sabrina, but the caption didn't say Mrs. Sterling. It said, "Vance Capital, investing in the future." The image showed Sabrina standing on the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange, ringing the opening bell. She wore a tailored white suit that screamed power and grace. Confetti rained down around her like snow. Standing just behind her, applauding with a look of unadulterated pride, was Julian Blackwood. Caleb stared at the screen, mesmerized in the interview clip. Playing on the jumbo screen, a reporter asked her a question. "Miss Vance, after everything you've been through, the betrayal, the corporate theft, the divorce, how did you find the strength to rebuild so quickly?" On the screen, Sabrina smiled. It was the same smile she had given him on their wedding day, but now it belonged only to herself. "I didn't rebuild," she said, her voice amplified across the square. "I just stopped holding up a crumbling building. Sometimes you have to let the weak structures fall so you can build something that lasts." She looked at the camera, and for a split second, Caleb felt like she was looking directly at him. Through the screen, and I realized, she continued, that I was never the accessory. I was always the architect. The guard shoved Caleb forward. "Move it, Sterling." Caleb stumbled onto the bus. He sat near the window, pressing his forehead against the cold wire mesh. As the bus pulled away, merging into the traffic of the city he had once thought he owned, he watched the billboard shrink into the distance. Sabrina and Julian were still up there, frozen in pixels, larger than life, immortalized in their victory. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he tried to remember the code, the algorithms, the genius that had made him rich. But it was gone. It had never been his. It was like trying to remember a dream after waking up miles away in the private office of Vance Capital. Sabrina turned off the television. The office was quiet, filled with the soft hum of servers and the scent of fresh lilies. She walked to the floor, to ceiling window, looking out at the city skyline. "It is done," a voice said behind her. Julian walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one on her desk and stood beside her, looking out at the view. He didn't try to hug her or claim her. He just stood there, a solid, reassuring presence. "How do you feel?" he asked. Sabrina took a sip of coffee. "Light," she said, "incredibly light." She turned to him. "Julian." "Yes, the letters," she said softly. "The ones you wrote." Julian tensed slightly. "I shouldn't have brought that up. It was presumptuous." "No," Sabrina shook her head. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple, elegant fountain pen. She handed it to him. "I want you to write me a new one," she said, her eyes shining. "But this time, sign your own name." Julian looked at the pen, then at her. A slow, dazzling smile broke across his face, erasing years of waiting and silence. "I have a lot to say," he warned her, taking the pen. 7 years' worth. "I am not going anywhere," Sabrina replied. She turned back to the window. The storm was over. The wreckage was cleared, and for the first time in her life, the view wasn't blocked by anyone's shadow. She was the architect of her own life now, and it was going to be a masterpiece. Let's elevate this for a moment. Caleb's ultimate sin wasn't the affair. It was the plagiarism of a life he didn't earn. He copied Sabrina's genius. He copied Julian's romance. And he tried to copy-paste a brand new life using embezzlement. He called Sabrina furniture because she was quiet. But foundational pillars don't make noise, do they? They just hold the roof up. Sabrina is no victim here. She didn't beg for her seat at the table. She simply looked at the crumbling, termite-infested structure of her marriage, stepped outside, and pressed the demolition button. She didn't rebuild. She cleared the lot. That is the difference between surviving and outclassing. So here is my question for you. Have you ever played the quiet supporter to someone who mistook your silence for weakness? When did you finally decide to stop holding up their roof and let the walls cave in? Tell me your notice of revocation moment in the comments. I'll be reading them.